Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Welcome to Prog Chattery 777, and today we are concluding our conversation on the Mars Volta with this, their sixth and final studio album, Noctourniquet. This was released in 2012, and similarly to the previous album, Octahedron, this represents another fairly significant and drastic change for the Mars Volta. So as per usual, the Mars Volta comprises of Cedric Bixler-Zavala on vocals, lyrics, and vocal melodies. Omar Rodriguez-Lopez plays guitar, does the musical arrangements, and on this album plays a hell of a lot of synthesizers. Very important, very significant aspect to this album. And joining them is the smallest incarnation of the Mars Volta group. We only have Joan Alderet on bass, long-standing bass player, and new drummer, D'Antoni Parks, who's replacing Thomas Pridgeon on this album. Now, D'Antoni was actually already in the band back around the Amputecture era when they were looking for a new drummer to replace John Theodore, but they ended up going with Thomas Pridgeon instead. So even though D'Antoni had played live with the Mars Volta, this is his first actual studio album as the drummer. Notably absent, Marcel Rodriguez-Lopez, brother of Omar, is not on board as percussionist on this album, and Ike Owens, the keyboard player, is also not present. So including Cedric and Omar, this is the only Mars Volta album that is essentially a four-piece. It's a very, very small incarnation of the band. And like I mentioned before, I think the most significant thing about this album is the presence of synthesizers. They very much dominate this album, which is unlike any of the other Mars Volta albums. It is Omar playing the synth, so it's not like, he's been replaced, but the guitar sound, the guitar-dominated sound that had been such a big part of the Mars Volta is, effectively switched around. The guitar very much takes a back seat to the synths on this album, which is very, very, interesting and cool. In a lot of ways, you could almost say that this is kind of a typical Mars Volta album, except with synths as the lead instead of guitar. So again, very, very big textural changes. I think it's probably on the whole a bit heavier than Octahedron, but I mean it tends to get compared to Octahedron because, again, it still doesn't sound anything quite like Loudest and the Comatorium through to Bedlam and Goliath. So that's interesting. I think a lot of people probably think of Octahedron as a transitional album. That's the transitional album to get to Noctourniquet. But I've kind of seen it a little bit differently. I think Noctourniquet is a transitional album to something that we never got to see. Because, of course, the Mars Volta ultimately burned out and broke up in 2013, just a year after this was released. So we never got to see what was going to happen next. But I don't know, Octahedron feels more like, an interesting experiment in terms of stripping everything back and experimenting with space. That's kind of the theme with Octahedron as far as I can see it, whereas Noctourniquet, they're back to filling all the space, but they're filling it with the synthesizers instead of the guitars, so you get that, it still feels spacey, but there's still a lot of information in that stereo space. But it is certainly an interesting album. I actually get a lot of Genesis vibes listening to this, of all things. I think if they had carried on and continued making albums after this, they could well have produced they could have done a full-out Genesis. They could have pulled a Genesis. Because the pop influence, I think, is stronger on this album than on any other album. I've made a point of saying that I think that pop thing had been a part of the Mars Volta, right through to the, from the very beginning. The earlier albums, the pop sensibilities are kind of hidden with all the madness and the frantic craziness. And then when they stripped it back for Octahedron, it's like, oh, you can kind of hear those melodic hooks all of a sudden. And this is the first time I think they may have consciously exploited Cedric's talent for writing a good pop melody. Because there's a number of tracks on here that you listen to it and it's like, wow, like that's a straight up pop song. But again, that's not a bad word. I said in the last video, there's nothing that, commercial, pop, accessible. These are not bad words. It's all about the form, right? And there's always good examples of pop music and bad examples of pop music. And I think Mars Volta were making quite interesting stuff. I hope I'm not getting a glare on the screen. There's an awful lot of sunlight coming in. It's probably my face is probably looking really funny right now, but we'll carry on in spite of that. Very interesting artwork. This is, again, kind of separates it from the other albums, and there's a different artist that they used. Gone are the Jeff Jordan album covers, and gone are the Storm Thurgeson album covers. So again, change was in the air at this time, and they just never managed to stick around long enough to see that change through. But that's okay. They still left us with 6 fantastic albums. But before I wrap it all up, let's try and talk about the tracks. So it is a concept album, although again, I couldn't tell you what the storyline or the plot or any of that is. It's typical Mars Volta. It's very, very cryptic and hallucinatory and not necessarily easy to understand. But it's about the music, man. That's what it's all about. So yes, the album opens with the Whip Hand, and right away you hear a change. It opens with that kind of repetitive little synthy pattern, and then the drums kick in, and probably one of the most simple drum patterns to open up a Mars Volta album, actually. Boom da boom da boom da boom da boom da. Very kind of what's the word, primal kind of a rhythm, and it's joined by the raunchy guitar playing. And then immediately, once the verses come in, we get that. The synths are immediately right there, so that again sets up the tone for the album quite nicely. And I like the chilled out verses with those kind of like laser beam synths, and then when the chorus explodes, you get that really big frenzied big synth line. Sounds like a monolithic fly or something like that. But again, nothing like they had done before, and it's still heavy. It has all the bombast and frenzy as some of the other Mars Volta stuff, but again, the guitar has been replaced by synthesizer, so it's a tonal change more than it is a musical change, I would argue. First one's definitely not a pop song. It's definitely scary, and there's a very threatening sort of vibe to that one, particularly like towards the end where we get Cedric's "I am a landmine." Classic crazy Cedric. Who knows what the hell he's talking about, but it's good and it really does capture your attention. We get that classic Volta thing where it all, everything kind of, and then back into the scary synth pad. So very, very interesting way to open up the album for sure. Track 2 is Aegis. Aegis, I have no idea how to pronounce it, but it's a good song. Bit more of a typical Mars Volta drum pattern, but it's not as... The verses certainly aren't as bombastic as typical Mars Volta. It's just got that simple, two-note chord progression. Ding, 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 ding. But creepy melody, and then when the chorus kicks in, we get that classic Mars Volta frenzy. But it's more raw. There's, it's not as filled out as something like Francis the Mute or Tetragrammaton, or Cygnus Visman Cygnus, not Francis the Mute. That's a different song altogether that I haven't talked about, but no distractions here. Gotta stay focused. The thrashy part on Aegis, and the next track actually, it does feel a lot more raw. I think that's just from the sheer fact that it's a stripped down lineup of only 4 members. So it's classic Volta sound, but not quite as filled out, I guess. But it is guitar based. So that's really cool. Again, really, really strong chorus. I love the and they're running away. Classic Cedric hook right there. Really, really good stuff. Moving on to track 3, Dyslexicon. Classic Mars Volta title. And again, this is probably closest to the classic Mars Volta sound, if there is one. Very shouty chorus. Yeah, it's quite cool. I like the frenzied beginning too. Again, we get that classic Volta sound, but with that synth pass. I like how that kind of just bounces on one side of the studio, on one side of the stereo space, and then we get Omar's crazy guitaring on the other side. But yeah, pretty classic Volta track. All the classic sounding stuff is kind of pushed towards the front of the album, so it might be a bit of a front-heavy album ultimately, not quite as well balanced as some of their others, but yeah, whatever. It's all good. I really like Dyslexicon. Then we move on to Empty Vessels Make the Loudest Sound. This is track 4, and this is where we really start to hear that modern pop starting to come through. Um, really nice, really nice track. Again, I get a Genesis vibe. You know, the electronic drums. I mean, they don't, you know, they don't necessarily remind me of the drum machine that's on Duke for the song Duchess, but it's like they're trying to do a similar thing, even though it doesn't sound anything like it. The atmosphere conjures up something similar, and again, very sing-alongable chorus. Oh, I forget what the words are, but you know that melody is very easy to latch onto. Um, but it's quite cool. More in the mellow vein of what the Mars Volta do, but it doesn't seem that they're not playing with space as much as they are on Octahedron. So it's mellow, but it's still full, if that makes any sense. But definitely one of the highlight poppier songs on the album, certainly. Moving on to track 5, we get the first single off the album. This is the Malkin Jewel. And again, I think this must have thrown people for a loop, because it's, again, really nothing like the Mars Volta had done before. It's not necessarily mellow and ballad-like the stuff on Octahedron, but at the same time it's not fast and frenzied and completely out of control as some of the other stuff. And I love that raunchy riff and the kind of you know, the drum beat that kind of keeps falling apart. There's that 70s vibe again that's present in some of their other tracks, but boom chicka chicka boom boom chicka chicka boom. It's really cool stuff, and a very different vocal technique from Cedric as well. He's singing very low, and you know, it's almost a whispered take that he sings, and it's very menacing and excellent. Then we get towards the end of the track, the second half of the Malkin Jewel, and we get it's just this long pulsating build up, and you know, it kind of creeps up on you. But by the time you get to the end of it, and the drums are in their full craziness, and that synth line, that really, you know, epic, powerful, dramatic synth line that starts to go over all the madness, and all of a sudden, you know, you're sitting there and it sneaks up on you. All of a sudden you realize, you know, that is classic Mars Volta sound. It's just kind of been masked and it's been inverted a little bit, but by the time you reach the, you know, the height of that crescendo, it's you know, that classic technique that they had of, you know, just filling up the stereo space with as much information as humanly possible to confuse and disorient the listener. But yeah, Malkin Jewel is definitely a highlight of the album for me. Really a big fan of that. Moves us on to track 6, which is Lapochka. I think that's what it's called. Lapochka. Don't know. Their pronunciations are quite tricky. And this is another classic example of Mars Volta does pop. Again, the lead instrument here is very much the synthesizer. It's based on that kind of slow, menacing march. Wow, 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 wow. And that's not so pop-like. It's the melody that comes up, you know, that "How long can I wait?" Very pop-like, and that's where that seems to be the direction they were going in. Like I said, they almost pulled the Genesis. Who knows if it would have been a good or bad thing if they followed that through, but we'll never know. They broke up. But yeah, Lapochka, not one of the best on the album, but still quite good. Empty Vessels is definitely the better track there, I think. Anyway, moving on to track 7, In Absentia. This is definitely another album highlight for me. I think this is really fantastic. Kind of similar to Lapochka in that it opens with that slow, droning, you know, synth kind of a march. But it has this nice long extended a couple of long extended atmospheric sections where you have this kind of windy guitar sound. It's very distorted and loaded with reverb and whatnot, but those atmospheric sections in the first half of In Absentia really remind me of parts of The Lamb by Genesis. I've always got a Genesis vibe from this album. I don't know why. But and we get Cedric's craziness going on top of that. It's I can. It reminds. What's? I wish I could. It's on the second disc of the Lamb. I can't think of it now, but there's a specific instrumental interlude that's always reminded me of. But it is quite beautiful, and it's a cosmic, little atmospheric, mystical part. Even though, yeah, it's mystical, even though it's drenched with all these synth sounds. It's really, really cool. And then the second half of In Absentia, again, it's a two-part kind of a song. We get another really, really poppy little section with that great bass line. Very, very, very catchy, and it sticks in your head. And I'm not sure what he sing. I'm not sure what the heck he sings there. Something like that. Oh, it's gonna be too hard for me to find the lyrics here. The lyrics are very, very confusing. Oh well, but it's a great kind of poppy hook. Not bad at all. In Absentia, highlight on the album for sure. Moving on to track 8, we get Imago, which is another really great song. It's almost I compare it a little bit to Copernicus from the previous album. Not quite as spacious as Copernicus, but there's something, the way that the guitar line kind of responds to the vocal melody with that chorus. It's a little bit similar to Copernicus. A good but not best caliber track to the album. Imago, I'm not sure what it's called, but it's nice. Keeps the album paced appropriately. We move on to the next track, which is Molochwalker. A short, snappy little slice of classic frenzied Mars Volta. I think this track was originally set to be released on the Bedlam and Goliath, and it definitely has Bedlam kind of a feel to it. One of the few places on the album where the guitar is again leading instead of the synths, which is quite cool. Quite cool. I love those fast runs of Omar's, and then it changes quite a bit towards the end as well. Again, weird time signatures, but it's got that retro. There's a bit of that retro 70s feel to it. Definitely a good track. Again, not one of my favorites on the album, but it's another nice one of those high energy numbers that reminds us that we are in fact listening to the Mars Volta. Moving on, moving on to the last 4 tracks of the album. We get a pair of mellower ballads here. So it starts with Trinkets, Pale of Moon. I'd say this is almost like a follow-up to With Twilight as My Guide from Octahedron. Slow haunting with and led by the acoustic guitar, but there's more synth stuff that kind of washes in, and there are those dynamic parts that launch into it. It's got the drum machine kind of sections as well, so it's kind of a heavier version of With Twilight as My Guide from the previous album, but still very much in the acoustic ballad end of things. It's okay. This to me is actually where the album kind of lulls a little bit. This track and the next. So we get Trinkets, Pale of Moon, and then Vedamalady. Vedamalady. I'm not really too sure. Again, pronunciation is very difficult with this band. And it's another kind of ballad track. I think it's definitely heavier than Trinkets, Pale of Moon, but because Trinkets is so hypnotic and it kind of lulls you to a very relaxed state of mind, Vedamalady doesn't really, it feels like it just continues that crescendo, but it's probably my least favorite on the album, if I'm honest. It's never really grabbed me too much, and like I said, by the time I get to the end of that track, I'm starting to get a little bit sleepy. But that's okay, because the next track is the title track, Noctourniquet, and this is a highlight on the album for me. I really, really like it. It's a great balance between the guitar and the synths. There's a few sections where it is totally led by those kind of not bubbly, but swirling synth lines. But there's still that classic raunchy rock led by the guitar. A couple of the classic Cedric moments. I love the chorus of it. I love that, do you think whatever it is. I always forget the lyrics. I'm terrible for that. Sorry. But yeah, it is definitely a highlight track. I was immediately a fan of it. And it's funny. It's very unique in the Mars Volta catalog. There's nothing quite like it. But yeah, it's good. You have to take a listen to Noctourniquet. And that leads us to the final track of the album, Zed and Two Naughts, which I think is code word for the word zoo. Zed and then naught is 0. This is another interesting one. It's got that classic Mars Volta sound, but again, the synths and the electronic, contemporary electronic sounds are very, very prevalent to it. But that chorus is such a classic Mars Volta thing. Saint Christopher, it ticks all the Mars Volta boxes. And it's an okay to wrap up the album. I think there's no better way to finish off an album than with something as epic as Cassandra Gemini, but it wraps the album up quite nicely, and yeah, there you have it. It's a strange one. It feels the most removed from the other albums, and it took him the longest to make. I think there's the largest gap between albums is between Octahedron and Noctourniquet. So yeah, I get the idea that it may have been a fairly difficult album for them to make, and I think Omar was very much focused on his solo projects at the time, and I think he had loosened his grip with the band as well. I mean, the previous albums, Omar very much led the band with an iron fist, and I think there's a little more contribution from the other musicians on this album, even though, well, really there's only 3 musicians, and then Cedric on the vocals. So. Yeah, it's certainly an interesting moment in the catalog. It's not classic Mars Volta caliber, but it's very, very interesting. If you're interested in the Mars Volta, you have to pick it up, just because it is a curiosity. It's a good curiosity. There's still lots of good music to be enjoyed on here, and I think it may get a bit of an unfair. It's unfairly summed up sometimes, but it's the band moving towards something totally different, and there's that great edge of mystery in terms of where would they have gone after this? What would the follow up to Noctourniquet be? Would it be a full-out pop album? Would they have pulled a Genesis? We'll never know, because like I said, a year after this was released, the band imploded, and since then there has been no Mars Volta in the world. Although, thankfully, both Omar and Cedric have both expressed interest, and they said, there's lots to be done with the Mars Volta, so maybe one day we'll get another Mars Volta album, but it'll be a different thing, right? They've been apart for so many years now that when they get back together, they're going to start fresh. It's not going to be following through with what they did here. So, fingers crossed that Omar and Cedric get back together as the Mars Volta, and they continue to release lots of interesting and fantastic progressive type music. So I think on that note, I have nothing left to add. I'm sure I've gone well beyond my limit, as I usually do, with rambling and blah 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 blah. So thank you for putting up with all of that. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, thank you for tuning into the Mars Volta episodes. Not sure what's going to be up next, but I'm sure it'll probably be posted by the time this one gets posted. So whatever you do it well, and we will see you in the future. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care.